10 countries that depend on New Zealand for survival. Right now, in a hospital in Indonesia, a mother is feeding her newborn baby. But here's what she doesn't know. That formula keeping her child alive came from a farm 5,000 miles away in New Zealand. If those shipments stopped tomorrow, her baby, along with millions of others across Asia, would face malnutrition. This isn't just about baby formula. There are entire nations whose survival hangs by a thread, and that thread leads directly to New Zealand. From the internet cables beneath the Pacific Ocean to the dairy farms of Canterbury, this small island nation of just 5 million people holds the key to survival for hundreds of millions worldwide. Today, we're exposing the shocking truth about 10 countries that would face catastrophe without New Zealand. And the first one might be closer to home than you think. Which country with 4 billion people depends on New Zealand for something they consume every single day? China. And we're not just talking about trade deals here. Every morning, 400 million Chinese citizens start their day with a glass of milk. But here's the terrifying reality. China can only produce enough dairy to meet 70% of its domestic demand. The remaining 30% comes from one primary source, New Zealand. New Zealand is the largest exporter of whole milk powder globally, with around 95% of the milk produced processed for export. China is among the key destinations for these exports, receiving over $2.5 billion worth of dairy products annually. But it gets more alarming. Chinese parents have become so dependent on New Zealand infant formula that they've created a black market worth billions. Why? Because they trust New Zealand's safety standards over their own domestic production. Imagine if New Zealand's dairy farms were hit by disease tomorrow. Within weeks, store shelves across China would be empty. Cafe chains would shut down. But most critically, hospitals would run out of the specialized nutrition products that keep premature babies alive. China's survival doesn't just depend on New Zealand's milk. It depends on New Zealand's cows staying healthy. And that brings us to our next country, one that most people never associate with dependency. Here's a question that will shock you. Which developed nation imports 90% of its food? Singapore. This ultra-modern city-state, home to some of the world's wealthiest people, can't feed itself. With just 280 square miles of land, smaller than New York City, Singapore has no room for large-scale agriculture. They depend on food imports from 170 countries, but New Zealand holds a special position in their survival strategy. When COVID-19 hit and supply chains collapsed, Singapore learned a terrifying lesson. Countries started banning food exports to protect their own populations. Suddenly, this nation of 6 million faced the real possibility of starvation. New Zealand became their lifeline. While other countries closed their borders, New Zealand maintained steady shipments of dairy, meat, and essential proteins to Singapore. New Zealand's reliability during crisis turned it from a trade partner into a survival partner. But here's what makes this dependency truly frightening. Singapore's entire food security strategy now revolves around maintaining access to New Zealand's agricultural output. If that access was cut, this wealthy nation would have approximately 3 days of food reserves. Singapore's leaders know this. That's why they've invested billions in New Zealand's agricultural sector, essentially buying their way into survival. But what about countries that can't afford such investments? The next country on our list faces a crisis that's getting worse every single day. Can you guess which nation of 110 million people is slowly losing its ability to feed itself? The Philippines, and their dependence on New Zealand reveals one of the most tragic stories of modern food insecurity. 50 years ago, the Philippines was self-sufficient in dairy production. Today, they import 99% of their milk powder, and most of it comes from New Zealand. Why did this happen? Climate change and urbanization destroyed their agricultural land. Rising sea levels contaminated farmland with salt water. Tropical storms became more violent, wiping out entire harvests. The Philippines transformed from a food producer into a food importer almost overnight. Southeast Asia currently represents approximately 16% of New Zealand's dairy exports, with the Philippines being a major recipient. But here's the alarming part. They can't afford to pay premium prices indefinitely. When global food prices spike, as they did in 2022, the Philippines faces an impossible choice. Import expensive nutrition from New Zealand or watch their population suffer from malnutrition. During the last price surge, infant mortality rates in rural Philippines increased by 15%. Filipino mothers in remote islands depend on New Zealand's milk powder to keep their children alive. If those shipments stopped, an entire generation of Filipino children would face stunted growth and developmental issues. The Philippines' dependency on New Zealand isn't just about economics. It's about the survival of their youngest citizens. But dependency takes different forms, and our next country reveals how modern survival goes beyond food. What if I told you that a country's entire connection to the outside world runs through cables controlled by New Zealand? Welcome to Fiji's digital dependency. Fiji, with nearly 1 million people spread across 330 islands, relies on underwater internet cables that run through New Zealand waters. These cables carry 99% of Fiji's internet traffic, connecting them to the global economy. But here's the scary part. If those cables were damaged or if New Zealand restricted access, Fiji would be digitally isolated. No internet banking, no international communication, no access to global markets. This isn't theoretical. In 2019, when a ship's anchor damaged a similar cable, the island nation of Tonga lost internet access for 5 weeks. Their economy collapsed. Tourists couldn't book hotels. Students couldn't access online education. Hospitals couldn't share medical records. Fiji has learned from Tonga's nightmare. They've made agreements with New Zealand to protect those cable routes, essentially giving New Zealand control over their digital survival. When natural disasters hit Fiji, which happens regularly, those New Zealand-controlled cables become their lifeline to request international aid. Modern survival isn't just about food and water anymore. It's about staying connected to the global economy. And for Fiji, that connection runs directly through New Zealand's maritime territory. But some dependencies are even more invisible. Our next country's survival depends on something most people never think about. Here's a question that reveals a hidden crisis. Which country's hospitals would run out of life-saving medicines within 72 hours if New Zealand stopped one type of shipment? Vanuatu. This Pacific island nation of 300,000 people faces a medical dependency that could turn fatal at any moment. Vanuatu has no pharmaceutical manufacturing capability. Zero. They depend entirely on medicine imports, and New Zealand serves as their primary medical supply hub. Every vaccine, every antibiotic, every insulin dose arrives via New Zealand's shipping and air cargo networks. But here's where it gets terrifying. Many critical medicines have a shelf life measured in weeks, not years. Insulin must be kept refrigerated during transport. Cancer drugs lose potency if exposed to heat. Vanuatu's survival depends on New Zealand's cold chain logistics running perfectly every single day. When Cyclone Pam devastated Vanuatu in 2015, their medical infrastructure collapsed. Local pharmacies were destroyed. The hospital's medicine storage was flooded. For 3 weeks, New Zealand's emergency medical shipments were literally the difference between life and death for thousands of Vanuatu citizens. Today, diabetic patients in Vanuatu know they have about a month's worth of insulin in the entire country. If New Zealand's medical supply chain failed, people would start dying within weeks. This dependency goes beyond just shipping. New Zealand trains many of Vanuatu's doctors and nurses. When medical emergencies exceed local capacity, patients are evacuated to New Zealand hospitals. For Vanuatu, New Zealand isn't just a trade partner, it's their national emergency room. But what happens when dependency involves an entire continent's food security? Can you imagine a country where 270 million people depend on a single foreign nation for their children's nutrition? That's Indonesia's reality. If you're enjoying this kindly, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to like. And their dependence on New Zealand reveals how quickly food security can become a national security crisis. Indonesia is the world's 4th most populous country, but they face a shocking problem. They can't produce enough high-quality protein for their growing population. While they grow rice and vegetables locally, dairy and premium meat products come primarily from New Zealand. Here's what makes this dependency truly alarming. Indonesian parents have lost trust in locally produced infant formula after several contamination scandals. They now prefer New Zealand-made baby formula, even though it costs 3 times more than domestic alternatives. This has created a 2-tier nutrition system. Wealthy Indonesian families feed their children New Zealand dairy products and watch them grow healthy and strong. Poor families rely on local alternatives and struggle with malnutrition-related health issues. Indonesia is among New Zealand's biggest trade partners for dairy products, but this relationship has created an unexpected vulnerability. When New Zealand experiences droughts or disease outbreaks in their livestock, Indonesian babies suffer the consequences. During the 2020 supply chain crisis, New Zealand prioritized shipments to wealthy countries that could pay premium prices. Indonesia's imports were delayed by weeks. Indonesian hospitals reported increased cases of infant malnutrition during this period. Indonesia's dependency on New Zealand isn't just about preference anymore. It's about survival. An entire generation of Indonesian children depends on New Zealand's agricultural output for their basic nutrition. But some countries have turned dependency into strategic vulnerability. Which advanced economy has structured their entire food security strategy around accessing New Zealand's agricultural output? Japan, and their approach reveals how dependency can become a calculated national strategy. Japan imports 60% of its food, but their relationship with New Zealand goes far beyond simple trade. They've invested billions in New Zealand's agricultural infrastructure, essentially buying guaranteed access to food supplies. Japanese companies own significant stakes in New Zealand dairy farms, meat processing facilities, and logistics networks. This isn't just business, it's survival strategy. Japan's leaders know their mountainous islands can't produce enough food for 125 million people. But here's what makes Japan's dependency unique. They've made themselves indispensable to New Zealand's economy in return. Japanese technology keeps New Zealand's farms productive. Japanese financing supports New Zealand's agricultural expansion. Japanese distribution networks get New Zealand products to Asian markets. This creates mutual dependency, but Japan holds the weaker position. If political tensions arose, Japan would lose access to critical food supplies within months. Their strategic food reserves would last approximately 6 months. Japan's dependency on New Zealand reveals how modern food security works. It's not about growing your own food anymore. It's about controlling the supply chains that bring food to your population. Japan has chosen to secure their survival by making New Zealand's agricultural sector dependent on Japanese investment. But what happens when survival depends on expertise rather than products? Here's a disturbing question. Which country would lose 40% of their healthcare workers overnight if New Zealand changed one policy? Samoa. Their survival depends on New Zealand's healthcare system in ways most people never realize. Samoa has a population of 200,000 people, but can only train about 12 doctors per year locally. The rest of their medical professionals, doctors, nurses, specialists, are trained in New Zealand universities and hospitals. This creates a terrifying vulnerability. When New Zealand changes their immigration policies or medical training requirements, Samoa's healthcare system faces immediate crisis. In 2019, when New Zealand tightened work visa requirements, 15 Samoan doctors were forced to return home before completing their specialization training. But the dependency goes deeper. Samoa's most complex medical cases are referred to New Zealand hospitals. Cancer patients, cardiac surgery, organ transplants, all depend on New Zealand's medical system. Samoa's national health budget actually includes funding for New Zealand hospital treatments. Here's the most shocking part. During the 2019 measles outbreak that killed 83 people in Samoa, their medical system collapsed because they didn't have enough trained medical staff. New Zealand had to send emergency medical teams to prevent a complete healthcare catastrophe. Samoa's survival depends on New Zealand's willingness to train their medical professionals and treat their sickest patients. This isn't trade, it's medical colonialism disguised as cooperation. Our next country shows how dependency can involve an entire region's economic survival. What if I told you there's an entire region of the Pacific where every single economic transaction depends on systems controlled by New Zealand? The Pacific Island nations, Tonga, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Cook Islands, and others, have become economically dependent on New Zealand in ways that go far beyond trade. These nations use New Zealand banks for international transactions. Their currencies are often backed by New Zealand dollar reserves. Their shipping routes all pass through New Zealand ports. Their airline connections to the rest of the world go through New Zealand airports. This creates a spider web of dependency where New Zealand sits at the center. When New Zealand's economy faces problems, every Pacific Island nation feels the impact immediately. But here's the most critical dependency: climate change adaptation. As sea levels rise, these island nations face complete submersion. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Their survival plans all involve eventual migration to New Zealand. New Zealand has become their long-term survival strategy. The Cook Islands, with 15,000 people, already has more citizens living in New Zealand than in their home islands. This creates a unique form of dependency. Their cultural survival depends on New Zealand's continued acceptance of climate refugees. These small island nations have essentially made a deal with New Zealand. They provide strategic military positioning in the Pacific Ocean in exchange for economic protection and eventual refuge from climate change. But our final country reveals the most shocking dependency of all. Which country would face immediate economic crisis if New Zealand stopped sharing one critical resource? Australia. Yes, Australia, a continent-sized nation with 26 million people, depends on New Zealand for survival in a way that would shock most people. Australia and New Zealand share the closest economic relationship in the world through their Closer Economic Relations Agreement. But hidden within this partnership is a critical vulnerability: water expertise. Australia faces chronic water scarcity across much of their continent. New Zealand has become their primary source of water management technology, expertise, and emergency assistance. When Australia's rivers run dry, New Zealand experts design their survival strategies. During Australia's recent drought crises, New Zealand water engineers kept Australian cities from running out of drinking water. When bushfires contaminated water supplies, New Zealand companies provided emergency purification systems. But the dependency goes deeper. Australia's agricultural exports, worth billions, depend on irrigation technologies developed in New Zealand. If that expertise disappeared, Australia's food export economy would collapse within years. Australia has become dependent on New Zealand's water expertise for their basic survival. In a continent where water determines everything, this dependency could become critical as climate change intensifies. 10 countries, hundreds of millions of people, all dependent on a small island nation most people couldn't locate on a map. New Zealand's power isn't measured in military strength or economic size. It's measured in the invisible threads that connect their farms, their expertise, and their strategic location to the survival of entire nations. The next time you see Made in New Zealand on a product, remember, you're not just looking at a label. You're looking at a lifeline that keeps hundreds of millions of people alive, connected, and functioning in our interconnected world. Which of these dependencies shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to discover more hidden dependencies that shape our world, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because in our globalized world, survival is never as simple as it seems. Thanks for watching.